Really excited to share with you some more details about our app groups and policy mappings functionality. So just to go through a user scenario, what is this feature? Who is it for? Imagine you're a platform engineering leader and you just need finer grained control over how your Kubernetes guardrails or action items are being reported. So for example, you may want to define a set of cluster-wide best practices that all your workloads abide by, but you also want to make sure you're creating policy exceptions for certain resources. So certain teams or certain apps don't have to be subject to those policies. You may also have mission critical applications that have to be compliant with additional security policies above and beyond the baseline, and you want to be able to enforce those. And you may also want to try to reduce, this concept of information overload or action item overload by only focusing on a few policies to start. So those are a couple scenarios that we took into account when we built this feature. So let's introduce the concepts of app groups and policy mappings. First, app groups are really user-defined collections of Kubernetes resources. You can match on any Kubernetes metadata, such as namespace, cluster name, kind, etc. And this also stretches across multiple clusters. So you can set up an app group to select resources across multiple clusters or a single cluster. It's up to you. Policy mappings are similar in that they're user-defined collections of policies. So you may create a policy mapping around SOC 2 controls or reliability checks, and ultimately policy mappings and app groups are linked together. So let's go through an example. First, on the left here, we have 3 different app groups that we'd like to create. The first app group is called All Workloads, and it really is just selecting everything in my cluster. And this is useful to create as a starting point because there may be cluster-wide policies or baseline policies you'd like to apply to that. The second and third app groups are for different business units or different teams in my organization. So I may have a business app group that is responsible for 3 namespaces and a finance app group that's responsible for 2 namespaces. On the right side here, I have 2 different policy mappings. I have cluster best practices as well as security and compliance best practices. And so I'd like to associate cluster best practices with all of my workloads. I want to make sure everything in my cluster at least has pull policy set to always and memory and CPU requests. And then some of my teams or business units are going to be subject to additional security and compliance policies, such as the one I've listed on the right. So let's see what this looks like in practice. First, we'll go to the new app groups UI, and you'll see this on the left where it says app groups. And there's going to, in this case, I've already created a couple for demo purposes, but you'll see that I have actually defined kind of that all resources app group where it's selecting everything. So if I create an app group and I don't put any details into any of these fields, by default, Insights will select everything across all your clusters. And that's sort of default behavior today. I also have created a finance app group, and right now it's very simple. It's just focusing on the finance app namespace. We also have the concept of excluding resources. So if there were, for example, specific kinds inside that namespace that I want to ignore, let's say cron job as a kind, I can go ahead and do that. For now, I'm not going to do that, but you can be very creative in terms of how you match and exclude resources in an app group. And then finally, I have a product org, I call it. Its namespace is the business app namespace, and that's another app group that I've created. We also have this concept of policy mappings under the policy tab. If you go ahead and click on policy mapping, you'll see that I've created a couple policy mappings very similar to the slide that I shared earlier. Now, before I get into that, we do have this new concept called scan mode that is very important for understanding how app groups and policy mappings work together. So by default, Insights is set to everything, which means it's going to scan for all policies across all resources. And that's good if you want maximum coverage, but it also can create this information overload effect. So if we go to my example here, you'll see that I've got about 94 different action items in my organization. Now, if I go back to the policy mapping, I'm actually going to move the scan mode to focused. And what focus means is I'm only going to scan for the resources and policies defined in the app groups and policy mappings that I've created. I'm going to go ahead and update that. And when I go to the action items page now, you'll see that I only have 25 results. And that's because of the app groups and policy mappings that I've created in the system are actually focusing what Insights will report on. So let's take a look at that. If I go to my baseline policies app group, you'll see that it's selecting resources within the all resources app group. You'll also see that it's subject to 3 policies here. It's going to bring in all the trivia findings, memory requests missing, as well as CPU requests missing, and it's going to run it in these 3 different contexts. And then similarly, under the security policies one, I'm going to have this subject to the product org and finance group app groups, but it's only going to be checking for run as root allowed. So with those in effect, you'll see that the action items in my list are now greatly reduced. Now there's only 25 items, and it's just the checks that just the policies that we went through. So this is a great way to kind of manage that information overload experience while also creating kind of fine-grained rules around what you want to enforce or what you want to report on. Now, let's spend a few minutes to talk about enforcement or blocking behavior and how policy mappings can help you set those up as well. So in this example, we created these 2 policy mappings, one for baseline policies and one for security policies. So if I open up the baseline policies example, again, you'll see that we've got this running in 3 contexts: the agent, admission controller, and the repo scanning or CI context. And we also have this option of declaring what type of blocking or enforcement behavior do we want to set up. Now, by default, any of the policies with a severity of high or critical will be blocked. That's our default behavior for things like admission control or repo scanning. But in this case, because they are baseline policies and I really feel strongly about enforcing these across my organization, I'm actually going to set this up to always block on these policies, regardless of the severity, if any of those items show up in a admission request or a repo scan. So I'm going to go ahead and update that policy mapping. And I'm going to do the same thing for the security policies. These 2 app groups are really important for my organization. I want to make sure that none of the containers are configured to run as a root user. And so I'm always going to block when a container or a policy is found with this violation. Now, if I go to an example YAML file, one that might look like your standard deployment, you can see here I'm actually have a few different policy violations that will trigger the admission control. So one example here is it's configured to run as a root user, which is obviously in violation of one of my policy mappings. And you'll also see it's missing the resource requests and limits that I need. So when I go ahead and navigate to the admission control page, you can see that we've actually have blocked this particular deployment because it's violating all 3 of these different policy scenarios. And if I go ahead and click into any of these, you'll also have the option of seeing that it is blocked, but you can resolve it as a permanent exception, or you can provide a time-based exception such as 1 day, 1 week, or 1 month, so that you give that team sort of a grace period to deploy their application, but the policy be reinforced later. So that's just a small example of how policy mappings will also apply to the admission requests. And again, if you have any feedback or ideas for us, send them our way. We're excited to get your thoughts.